Hi, this is Shyam Sankar from Ekascloud. In this video, I will explain about an AWS service called API Gateway. So, what particularly is API Gateway? So, API Gateway is used to create, it's a service which is used to create, publish, maintain, monitor, and secure APIs. So when we talk about API, we have something called front end and back end in any application. It can be web application, it can be mobile application. So from the front end, so the users will use the front end. From the front end, we will get request, we will get the API request to the back end. So in AWS, we have something called API gateway through which we can route the uh, request to the backend. So there is something called endpoints in API. So we will have a common URL. This is like a HTTP. It can be HTTP. It can be anything. It can be. It will be a common URL, and it will be followed by a endpoint. So this is called as endpoint. So this have the endpoint called products, and this have the endpoint called orders. So from the front end, the user will send the API request so that he can retrieve the data from the backend or from the database. So the user will go through the API gateway, and this API gateway will route through the endpoints. So if the user is asking about the products, it can move to the Lambda function which have the product endpoint. If the user is asking about the orders, it can move to the Lambda function, which will provide the data related to the orders. So this is how API gateway works. So API gateway is used to connect backend service, which can be Lambda function, or it can be a Lambda function which is deployed on a VPC. So when we talk about API gateway, there are three types of deployment types. When there are three types of deployment when we talk about API gateway. So one is the edge optimized endpoint. So with the help of CloudFront, as we all know, CloudFront is a content delivery network all over the globe. So it will use the edge locations all over the globe so that the request will be fast and it will reduce latency for the request around the world. So with the help of CloudFront, with the help of the edge locations also, we can optimize, we can deploy the API gateway. Then another one is the regional endpoint. So we have a particular region in which the service is running, and the request will come from that particular region. So this will reduce latency that the request originate from the same region. If this request comes from the same region, it can the latency is reduced and it can reach the API gateways and it will reach the endpoint. So another one is the private endpoint. So this is the most secure thing because we are securely exposing the API only to other services in the VPC. So inside the VPC only we are exposing the API gateway. So it will be more secure when compared to other two. So the three things are edge optimized endpoint, which will use edge location and CloudFront so that the latency is reduced for the request around the world, whereas regional endpoints will reduce the latency that is originate from the same region. If the request come from the same region, it will reduce the latency, whereas in private endpoint, it will securely expose the API only to the services available in the same VPC. So it will not expose to other VPC. So these are the three type of deployment in API gateway. So the next thing we are going to see is API caching. We have something called API caching. So as I said before, this will be the user. It can be front end, it can be anything. The user will send the request to the API gateway, and the API gateway will forward it to the endpoint according to the user requirement. So we have something called API caching. So for example, let us say we are getting the same request to the endpoint and it is very slow. We have many requests, we have more traffic to the endpoint. If we have more traffic to the same endpoint, that the latency will be there. So that is where API caching comes in place. So if the number of calls to the backend, so with the help of API caching, we can reduce the number of calls to the backend. So the API caching will cache the request, the repeated request, so that it will not reach the endpoint. So for example, let us say the user is asking is sending a request to the API gateway, and the API gateway will check whether the API request is there, whether the endpoint data is there in API caching. If the data available in the API caching means the API, this API cache will send the data to the user so that the number of calls will be reduced to the backend. So backend is nothing but the endpoint. The number of calls will be reduced, and the latency of the request to the API will also be reduced. So API caching is used when we want to reduce the latency so that it will not reach the endpoint and it will not uh, become late, so that similar requests can be achieved with the help of API caching. So this is about the Amazon API gateway. Thank you.